So we are here today to record the third part of the interview about your life and your life trajectory from Berlin to Belgium to France during the tragedy of the Second World War, and then to the US, where you moved at the end of the 40s and where you've been living here happily since the 50s, yes. And so thank you very much for welcoming us again to talk about yourself. I know it's not easy for you, but I'm very grateful you are willing to do so. The last time we met, it was on Veterans Day, on November the 11th. And
right.
We talked about the war, we talked about the ceremony at the French consul residence in San Francisco, where you were awarded the Légion d'honneur by the consul on behalf of the French president.
Yes.
Since then, a month has passed, and France now is at war.
Yes.
There is a state of emergency that was declared nationwide.
Right.
And my beloved city of Paris is bleeding. A tragedy struck. And I was wondering, seeing these images of Paris under siege, if it brought any memories from your past.
Certainly did. Well, the memories I have of Paris there are basically three of them. First one is December 1940 to January 1941, when we had left Belgium and tried to join my father in southern France. And the second, on that one, I remember in the store windows they had these pictures of le Juif Russe and all that, and it was not blatant yet, but they were already in the process of blaming the Jews and all that. The second time in Paris, of course, was on August 25, 1944, and when we were not actually fighting the Germans, of which there were still many, and they had tanks, and we lost several tanks in the process. We had to fight off the population that was climbing over our vehicles to welcome us, and so it was a wonderful experience. And then the next day, which was the day, and I haven't seen any pictures since, but that was the day de Gaulle walked from the Arc de Triomphe down the Champs-Élysées to the Place de la Concorde, and then to Notre Dame for a Te Deum. So, and then we stayed in Paris for a short while before we moved on, and wherever we went, we were always welcome, because we were the regiment that had liberated Paris more than the other two. And the third time was, of course, when I moved there in 1948, 1947, when I took a year of preparatory schooling to try to pass one of the exams to get into the Grande École, which I failed. And then I went to work, and I had met Dick Seaver at the work camp in Le Chambon, and he was looking for a roommate, and I was happy. We had been very, met each other a couple of years before, and then he came back in 47. So we moved into Rue de l'Ancienne Comédie, which is a small, narrow street right off the Odéon, and had a student apartment. He had he had what used to be a bathroom, and I had what used to be the anteroom. I mean, it was small.
Could you remind us who Dick Seaver is?
Oh, Dick Seaver was had graduated from the University of North Carolina. Was very interested in French, in French language, and he decided he came to the work camps in 1946 and 1947, and then decided to use the GI Bill to stay in Paris and get a degree in comparative literature, which he proceeded to do even after I had left. So he was studying and literature, and we had so lots of artsy type friends. A painter who actually has a painting shortly thereafter had a painting in the I think the Museum of Modern Art. So he was already reasonably well known, but I can't remember his name. And so Dick and I were roommates, and he helped me out usually at the end of the month because I was not being paid very much. And even though the rent was what you would call dirt cheap, you still had to go out and eat. And end of the month was kind of difficult sometimes. And one of the things I remember on Saturday mornings, there was always a question of who was going to go downstairs. Next door, we could smell the croissant being baked, and so one of us would go and buy 4 croissants. That was our breakfast on Saturday. And
I think that also Dick Seaver mentioned you in his memoir.
Yes, he mentioned that he needed a roommate to share the cost. So we had a lot of the Chambonnais were in Paris, so we associated mostly with them because neither of us had made any local friends except for the French who had been living in Paris already and had gone to Le Chambon, to the work camps, or had gone to school and gone to the work camps.
And then I think so Dick Seaver became one of the major introducers of French literature to the US.
He became an editor when he came back to the US. He first worked for one of the big editing houses, and he introduced some of the, I think, if I'm not mistaken, he introduced Beckett to the American public, and somebody else, and so then eventually he went out on his own and created, trying to remember the name of the press he did. I'll come back, and he also got married to a charming young French lady, Jeannette.
And did you keep in touch with him?
Oh, absolutely. We kept in touch. I went down to see him. He had to go. That was during the Korean War. He had to go back. He was in the Naval Reserve, and he had to go back. And he was a lieutenant, naval lieutenant, on a cruise in Los Angeles, and they docked in L.A. And my wife and I went down to see him and visit with him. And then a couple of years later, he had gotten married, and he came to San Francisco, and the 4 of us went. We visited and went out to dinner together, and then we always exchanged Christmas cards and letters. And I went on business to New York, and on one of those typical days when there was a snowstorm and nothing worked. So I called him up, and I said, "I'm stuck in New York." And he said, "Well, I got a sofa, I went to his very nice apartment and slept in the bed, not on the sofa. And we had a very good time.
And was it any kind of password between the two of you? Yes,
we did, and I'll tell you, one of the last time we really saw each other, his son, one of his sons went to Stanford. And there were several of us, about 6 of us, at the restaurant on Bryant, L'Ami Dunya. And I was sitting there, and then somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Salut, Salo." And of course, I immediately knew who that, and he was having dinner with his wife and son, just a table or so away. I didn't see him. I didn't recognize it or didn't see him. And he saw me and recognized me. And that was our standard greeting, you know.
So salut, Salo,
Salut, Salo
was your standard greetings when you were in Paris already?
Well, when we hadn't seen each other for a while or we sort of, you know, met. But otherwise, it was just Dick and Walter, you know. The work campers used to call me Voltaire.
Voltaire.
You know, so that was sometimes my nickname when Americans were there, when we were together. It was Dick and Voltaire, you know. So.
And what did you do when you were in Paris? You said that you worked for a year after school and before going to the U.S.
Yes.
What type of work?
I was. I had stayed with a civil engineer who was the father of one of the people in Le Chambon, and they had offered me to stay there for the first year in 47, 48. And when I had to go to work, he just called some friends, and I was interviewed by, it was a small company that was building at the time something totally new in France. Were prefabricated buildings, and I was hired as what's referred to as a constructional draftsman, because all these buildings had to have very specific drawings down to the bolt size and the timber size and all the dimensions, and all of this had to be on separate pieces of you know, of paper, and for the construction people to follow instruction. And the buildings they built was for what became the nuclear plant at Donzère-Mondragon on the Rhone. And so I never saw them. We went by there by train, but I never saw the buildings that I helped draw.
And was it easy to find work in France at that time? Because were you already a French citizen?
Well, it was. I'm sure that if I hadn't had Monsieur Parker, who was the civil engineer and very well known, who had knew people, it would have been much more difficult. And in the spring of '49, there were strikes in Paris, major strikes, and the owner of the company called all us worker bees together and said, "You know, you're welcome if you feel like you want to go on strike, but once you get out this door, you're not coming back." And of course, we stayed we were happy to have a job, 48 hours a week, you know, including Saturdays. So.
And did you have any contacts with the Communist Party?
No.
Was the main driving force behind the strike?
No. While I was in the army still, probably a quarter of the people in the regiment were voted communists, and you know, but that was never an issue. It was just not talked about, except when you needed a clearance. They asked you, have ever been associated with communists, and well, I couldn't help it, you know. But and so in the summer of '49, it was another work camp, and the director of the work camp was always an American pastor or minister, and that year it was the Reverend Wilson, who was the minister of the Congregational Church in Providence, Rhode Island. And he did not speak French, so I was, 48, sorry. 1948. I was his translator, and at the end of the camp, we went together to Paris, and I showed him around, and he casually asked me, would you like to study in the U.S.? Well, sure, why not, And that was the end of that until it turned out the president of the University of Rhode Island was in his congregation, and he talked to him. They knew each other. And next thing I knew, in spring of '49, I got some papers saying, fill these out, and this is to be admitted to the University of Rhode Island, which was sort of a reverse Fulbright because it was a full scholarship. And so I filled them out and got a passport and got a visa. And in August of '49, I went, turned out, late August '49, went on one of those old Liberty ships that had been changed into troop ships and then became student ships, because there were thousands of American students, and they all went back. And many of them, of those who had been in the Chambon that year, were on that ship. And I stayed in touch and saw them when I was in the U.S. And so arrived in New York on Labor Day 1949, which turned out to be September 1, 1949.
And what was your idea of the USA? In your imagination, what images were prompted by this?
I had met many Americans in the service, but when you go down, my uncle was there and picked me up, and we took a cab from that pier to where he lived, and I mean, compared to New York, Paris is flat. I mean, there is 5-6 story houses, and even at that time, there were a huge number of skyscrapers, which are now flat buildings compared to what they built today, but it was just canyons. It was the impression you got when you walked downtown, and you had to crane your neck to see the top of the buildings, which you never had to do. And so it was, it was very interesting, and I did a lot of running around, kind of trying to, using the subway and the buses, which was very easy, kind of thing.
So did you feel at ease right away, or did you feel displaced?
Well, I spoke the language at the time. I spoke it still with an English accent, but fluently, so I never had any problems with the language.
It's good you didn't talk it with a French accent.
Well, it wasn't I never felt uneasy in any way. I felt squashed in the New York subway on a hot summer day when it was overcrowded. But that's not, that's whether you're in the metro or the tube in London. That's all the same. No, I never felt any uneasiness. I felt it wasn't a question of feeling at home. It was a strange and new city. And so we did a lot of sightseeing. I remember the ferry to Staten Island was a wonderful experience. You see the Statue of Liberty, which I had seen on the way in on the ship, and taking the ferry at the time it was a quarter or something like that for a trip to Staten Island. It was fun.
And then how many years did you spend in University of Rhode Island?
Well, I only stayed in New York a few days, then went to stay a few days with Dick Seaver's parents in Thompson, Connecticut, and then after 3 or 4 days, it was time to go register at the university, and Dick's father drove me there, and I registered, and that was a totally different experience because, well, I had no clue. I knew what I wanted to do, but then they asked, well, what kind of elective do you want? Well, they had to explain to me what an elective was. I didn't know. So, well, I joined the international club because that sounded like the right thing to do. But then it turned out University of Rhode Island had a radio station, which was on tied to the electric wiring system, so it was just local. Mm-hmm. And I said, oh, wouldn't mind working on that. So I became the classical music player on the WHOE at the University of Rhode Island. That was my other elective. And of course, then I had 2 jobs. I worked at the cafeteria, all meals. You work. There was no serving, but there was the behind the counter work. There was then in the kitchen work, the dishes, and carting the crates of milk bottles, for everybody. And I always stayed on campus because I had no place to go. So during vacation time, most everybody left, but they would have a lot of things still going on at the cafeteria, so I worked there.
You didn't go to New York?
No, in the winter vacation, I went to New York, and then on the summer vacation, 1949-50, I went to New York the whole summer, and I worked. I worked. I had a job, 2 jobs. I had a job with the Quakers, whom I knew. Joe Howell was the minister, and he had been one of the directors of the work camps in Le Chambon, and I got a job with him. I got a job as a busboy at one of the New York, it was called the Brass Rail, and apparently they're still there. I worked at the Brooklyn Brass Rail as a busboy until the day one of the waiters they had hired temporarily managed to drop a tray with 8 plates while he was climbing up the stairs, and I was promoted to waiter on the spot. At the end of the summer, they asked you to write about what you did in the summer, and I told them about that and said it was the experience of working with Puerto Rican busboys and French chefs. Mm-hmm. So I usually got a somewhat better meal than most because one of the chefs was an Alsatian, and he and I really related to each other. We always spoke in French, and he would hand me tidbits that were not on the menu for busboys. Mm-hmm.
And were you nostalgic about France, or was it behind you?
I saw quite a few of the people who had been in Le Chambon who were going to school in the U.S. At Swarthmore, at Bryn Mawr, the one near in New York. Can't think of it. As a matter of fact, I think Reverend Wilson took me up there to give a speech about Le Chambon to the. It starts with H. I'll come back. And so, I was taking. I mean, the standard curriculum was like 18 units. I was taking 23, 24, mm-hmm. because I was trying to catch up. I had missed 5 years of high school, and as I told you, just squeaked by my French baccalaureates. Mm-hmm. Well, I did real well in class, but I worked a lot, and I also did correcting papers for the French department and the German department, and so mm-hmm. I earned sort of as much money as I could to help for the extraneous expenses.
And at the University of Rhode Island, were you involved with the Jewish students? Were there Jewish student association?
What kind of
Jewish?
Yes, but very few. I didn't. As a matter of fact, I think there was a Jewish fraternity, maybe, or something like that. Was in no way involved in any of that. I had some girlfriends, that you met, and I did not. I didn't socialize really, like most of the students did. I mean, like, there was quite a bit of, it was called going down the line to Wakefield, because there was no alcohol at Kingston, and they would come back and had had a few beers, and so I'll tell you one thing that was of interest. In the spring of '51, the chief dietitian, for the first time, got artichokes, which were basically unknown in the East. And she was going to serve artichokes to this 400 students in the room, and she said, "Walter, you tell them how to eat artichokes," because she knew. And so I stood on a table, and she tapped the glass, and you listen to Walter here explain to you how to eat these artichokes. And so I told them the way I was trained to eat artichokes. You only eat the end of the leaf with your teeth. But I said, we used to put the knife underneath the plate, so tilt it a little bit, and then you poured some oil and a little bit of vinegar, and then you used your fork to kind of beat it, and then you took the leaf and dipped it and ate it. So I explained that to the 400 students in the thing, and I think that if those are still alive might even remember that, because nobody had ever eaten an artichoke before. And so...
And then, so you got your BS in electrical engineering?
I got my bachelor's, and at the time then I decided I wanted to see if I could get an advanced degree. And I had a number of opportunities, schools in the East. And Stanford, I had applied to Stanford because in electrical engineering, it was either MIT or Stanford. Those were the kingpins of the profession. And Stanford, the reason Stanford was that way, because of Dean Turman, who had been during the war at the radiation lab and had really made the School of Engineering and Electrical Engineering a close second to MIT. So I was interested from a professional point of view, but then I'd been on the Eastern Seaboard, New England, down to Pennsylvania, and how can you resist not going out to the West Coast? And I had a full assistantship, so money was no object. I had to work for whatever extra I got, which I did, but I took the Greyhound bus, which was the cheapest way to go from New York to San Francisco. And I looked at the map, and I decided, well, I'd like to make a break in the 5-day, 5-night journey, and I picked Cheyenne, Wyoming. I mean, cowboy country, I mean, for a European, that's what you want to see. Well, it turned out Cheyenne, Wyoming was still cowboy country. They were, the funny thing was, they were these big, tall Anglo guys carrying guns, and the little Mexican, they had a lot of Mexican cowboys. And there were boardwalks and other things along the side of the street. I had called her an aunt, whom I knew, and I'd known her, and she was Swiss, and she was born in Switzerland, but they had emigrated to San Francisco, lived in Berkeley. So I knew her, but I would write a Christmas letter maybe or something like that. I didn't really know anybody, and so, but I did didn't know her. And when I came to San Francisco, I got off at 7th and Mission and walked down to the 2nd Street and took the streetcar across the Bay Bridge to Berkeley, and then took a bus and then walked a block or two to where she lived. And I stayed with her for a few days, and then it was time to go register in Stanford. And well, San Francisco was always, I didn't have much time to go see San Francisco at the time. I saw Berkeley, more of Berkeley in the few days. But then we drove down Skyline, which was a beautiful drive, all the way down to, I guess, where you cut off to Portola Valley and to the campus. And the campus was, compared to today, a miniature. It was very compact. There was the quad, and it had some outbuildings, where the shopping center and all these things. That was the farm.
The farm.
That's where they had raised the prize bulls, the prize horses. It was a little bigger, not only because there's more land, a little bigger than the University of Rhode Island, but it was a really small campus. There weren't that many students there either.
What was the mood?
What was
the mood?
Well, that was still the time, just like in Rhode Island, when the last of the veterans were going to school on the GI Bill. And so I met a number of them. Some of them were in the same classes I was in. They didn't have enough dorm room for all the students they had accepted. I knew after the war when all the GI Bill students came. So they had been given by the government what was the Army Dibble Hospital, which is SRI International today. Yeah. And those were student dorm, these wooden buildings, and there was a cafeteria there. And if you needed a ride, which I did, there was at the corner of Ringwood and 4th Street on that little campus. You stood there, and whoever had a car picked you up and took you to campus, and same thing on the way home. And my first quarter roommate was a very nice ME graduate student, a Gujarati, Shanti Shah. And quite abnormally to my eyes, he would be on his head with his feet against the wall studying. And then one day, he got a care package from home. Oh, he was just in heaven. And he said, "Oh, you got to taste." There was a chapati, what do they call it? What's a flatbread? And he broke off a piece, and I started eating it, and I thought my throat was on fire. And I rushed to the water fountain, and he just laughed his head off. He ate that like I ate chocolate. It was just so spicy.
So Stanford was already an international place. There was many students.
Yeah, there were several others. One of my classmates was Alan Brown, was English. Dave Middlebrook became a professor at Caltech. He was in my class. It was an Australian, I can't remember his name. He became a professor at Stanford after graduation. There was a Greek, George Karyotakis, who became a very important scientist at Varian. There were...
Were you the only one from France?
No, not that I know of. There were. No, I don't. I did not meet any foreign students. I met, French students certainly not. I met a lot of students who enjoyed speaking French and who were very good, had been in France and spoke reasonably good French, and they enjoyed talking to me, and
And would you talk about the war? Or
no, no. That was never a subject of conversation. My second roommate, and the second and third quarter roommates at the village, he was a first generation American. He was of Norwegian origin, and he had served in the Navy and the war, and so we talked a little bit about our wartime experiences, not particularly. One interesting thing was when he got married in summer '51, I was part of his wedding party. I was an usher or whatever, and I met his father. And my roommate, Oris Flatten, he was about 6'2", and it turned out he was a runt of the family. His brothers were all 6'5", and so on. His father was about 6'5". His father spoke broken English. Where he lived, where he had been brought up, they're all Norwegians. You know, and well, I thought that was kind of interesting, you know. And it turned out there were other places in the U.S. where the same thing was happening, whether it was Swedish or German or Finnish, and you know, I worked as an assistant. I met a number of people with whom I became lifelong friends. We became colleagues because we worked at the same place and we knew each other. Particularly one of the professors, Dr. Peterson, Alan Peterson, who worked both at the university and at then Stanford Research Institute, we became good friends. He was very kind, and we kind of worked. Turned out after a while, then when I was at SRI, we worked in an area which a little bit exclusive because of the kind of work it was, and he was very, you know, we became very good friends, and he was a very well known, internationally known person in the field that I was in, basically, in the investigating the disturbed ionosphere, whether man-made disturbance, namely nuclear tests, or natural disturbance, which like solar flares, which still happen to this day. They had no more nuclear tests, but it's still solar flares. So my time at Stanford was basically, I felt I had gotten a first grade education, unquestionably. Certainly the level of the instructors was far above what I had been exposed to at Rhode Island, the professors. And of course the people in the class were, you know, they were not run-of-the-mill either. They were very intelligent people, many of whom got PhDs and became very well known in their particular fields. Some of them having to do with Stanford Linear Accelerator. And you know, when you these were people some of them became roommates after I was through with school and was working, housemates actually, and then when I moved to SRI, Stanford Research in '56, a number of them were working there.
So how did you make the translation from Stanford to SRI? So you graduated from Stanford?
I came here on, I was admitted to this country on a student visa. Okay. And as part of the regulation at the time, after you graduated, you were entitled to 3 6-month periods of practical experience. My first 6 months were at Stanford as an assistant, and that was a Korean War. They were people were looking desperately for for people who, you know, who were graduate students from Stanford. And I interviewed, and I was offered a job at a small electronic company in St. Carlos, Sierra Electronics. And I worked there for 3 years. There was practical working on transmitters and things like that, and components. And I was there in my second 6-month period, and I told the boss when I started my third period, you know, at the end of 6 months, I have to leave. Well, unbeknownst to me, one of the silent partners of this company was Senator Kuchel of California. So he called his friend, Senator Kuchel, who proceeded to write a letter. Now, I was working on a U.S. Army Signal Corps contract, and I was working on something rather important for the Signal Corps. So Senator Kuchel wrote a letter to the Director of Immigration Naturalization Service and saying, we got this guy working for us on a very important Signal Corps contract, and we can't afford to lose him. What, can you do something? And next thing I knew, I got paperwork from San Francisco office for a change of status from student visa to immigrant. Well, yes, that was just fine with me. I was in touch with friends in France and with my family in Belgium, and they had sort of asked so often, when are you coming back? And by that time, my answer was, I'm not coming back, I found paradise. And of course, now that I was an immigrant, you know, I had no reason to go back. I was very happy here. I was earning a great salary at the time, for what it was at the time, and doing a job I loved. And so after 3 years at that company, I thought, well, working on transmitters and components, but I would like to do R&D. So I approached one of my friends who had graduated and was working at Stanford Research, and the other person was Alan Peterson, who was doing post jobs. And so I had an interview with then the director of engineering, and he offered me a job, and that was in February of '56. And I happily accepted and spent the next 36.5 years at SRI. And to this day, there are still people, some of them went to school a little after I did, but we still have the Stanford connection. Of course, the dish, as everybody knows, well, we built that dish for the Defense Department originally. And it was quite an issue about whether it was going to mar the horizon for Stanford. And I remember Dr. Peterson going up to the proposed site and having a red balloon to the height of what the dish was going to be, and then coming back to the campus and asking people to look at that balloon to see if they thought it would be obnoxious. You know, no, it was not. And so we built.
Have to thank you for this iconic trademark of Stanford.
Yeah, you have been there to know those stories. And so that's when we built that dish for the Defense Department. And it was not the first big dish we built. We had built one before in Scotland, which was a little bit smaller. It was a 142-foot dish. This one was 150. And the government liked it so much, they asked for the plans so they could build 3 more. So there's three siblings somewhere around, there's 2 in the US and 1 somewhere else. And
so your responsibilities within SRI took you around the world?
It became a part of my career for about 30 years or so, working for these people. And there wasn't a 3-letter agency I hadn't worked for at one point or another, contractual basis or
Yes.
or consultant basis or something like that. And it was fascinating. And I did other work. We had, before we had the big dish, we had a 60-foot dish, which was, you couldn't see. And I was in charge of satellite and missile tracking on that radar. And we were the first U.S. radar to get a radar echo off Sputnik 1, the first Soviet satellite. So that was, we made the local news on that.
So when was that?
That was in October 1957. Late October. It took us, the Russians didn't give you any position of their satellite. We had to figure it out, and with the help of Air Force Cambridge labs and astronomers were very much involved, because you could see. I remember taking my neighbors up to the hill, knowing at what time and where that satellite was going to come by, and you could see the streak of light going by, and everybody, kind of ooh, nod, and the first man-made satellite,
Yes.
So, and
then during so you stayed on until the
I,
end
st-
of your...
I stayed on, and I just recall one thing, which it may sound strange, but in a way, in the rest of the country, when the subject was, where did you graduate from? And you say, well, Stanford. That, like I said, it was either MIT or Stanford, and that was an entree to wherever. If you graduate from Stanford, you were good enough to talk to me, kind of a thing. And that, I don't know what it is now, because, but that used to be always a nice thing. And
what was the mood during the 60s, when it was really a time of political turmoil here in the Bay Area? And Berkeley, I think that Stanford had its very first demonstration.
There were
against the Vietnam War.
They were during the Vietnam War. There were many demonstrations at Stanford, of course, and as a matter of fact, a whole laboratory at Stanford that was doing Defense Department work was transferred to SRI, and then one day the students decided to come and demonstrate at SRI, and there were police from all over the Bay Area there to protect the place. Some of those three-letter agencies came and emptied any safe that contained any of their material and took it away somewhere else. We got it back eventually. It was part of our work, but there was, and the president of SRI at the time, I think it was Charlie Anderson, thought, why don't we try and be friendly and engage them in a conversation? And he decided to have coffee and donuts for the protesters. And my boss picked me as one of the people to go and talk to them, which I did, and it was a polite conversation. Nobody convinced anybody, but at least it was all peaceful. And they enjoyed the coffee and donuts, and that fact that they could stand there and chant that we were warmongering and murdering people because we were killing Vietnamese babies, which we were not, but that was the theme. So everybody went home happy. So that was, and of course the fact that at that time Stanford Research Institute was divorced from Stanford and became SRI International, and which did not affect us in any form and shape. We continued to have joint operations on the Hill, on the radar, and in some other fields. And there were, we on a technical level, and had absolutely no impact whatsoever.
And isn't it also that same year, in 1968, that you met Diana, your future wife?
Yes, I did. One of the things we did at SRI, I was telling the photographer about it, we played bridge every noon.
Okay.
Between 12:01 and 12:59 during lunch hour. And a couple of the bridge players were either single or one was divorced at the time, lived in Mountain View at Rengstorff and the Expressway. And one day, I guess it may have been a Friday or so, they were having bridge table. They had 2 tables, and somehow they missed one person. Excuse me. And it turned out Diana was in charge that week. And one of the SRI people said, "Why don't you call Walter Jaye? He loves to play bridge." And so I got this call from what was then Diana Shedler, and she said, "I'm a friend of Marilyn, who was one of the bridge players, and she said, you'd like to play bridge, and we have a bridge on Saturday, and would you be able to come?" "Sure, I can come." Mm-hmm. And she was my partner. And she played real well, and I thought she was a real nice lady. And so the next week, I gave her a phone call, and I said, "I'd like to take you out to dinner. How about the weekend after next?" And that shocked her, because typically people would call on Friday and say, you want to go out to dinner tomorrow night? And I said 8-9 days ahead of time. And we went out to dinner. We went to a very nice Italian restaurant in San Jose. And then we started dating all the time. And we dated for 2.5 years. And then I proposed to her, and she said yes.
So when did you get married?
We got married on July 3rd, 1968, at the Palo Alto Courthouse, and we had my secretary, with whom we got very, very close, was the Lady of Honor, Maid of Honor, and my best friend, who had worked at SRI but then left and worked at Ampex, was my best man. So there were the 4 of us, and Diana had said at work that she wasn't going to work that day because she was going to go and get married, and all the young ladies at the office were, I mean, completely bamboozled. "You mean you're just going to take off and go get married?" "Yes." And so they showed up with after the wedding with flowers, a bottle of champagne, and rice, which made the wedding official. Not the judge, but all the peripherals that went with a wedding.
And did you talk about the war and about your personal history to Diana right away, or did it take some years?
No, she didn't ask and I didn't tell. We both worked. After a year, less than that, we decided we ought to, instead of living in an apartment in Mountain View, we ought to try to buy a house. And we found a house. It was in December of '68 in Suburban Park, right a mile from here, and bought the house and lived there. And we had a very simple life. We both worked. We both had cars, and weekends were spent cleaning house. We didn't have a maid, couldn't afford that. And then whenever we could afford. We traveled, and I took her to Europe for her first trip to Europe in 1969 for a very nice. It was a KQED kind of sponsored trip, so it was a charter plane and to Amsterdam, and we did our own thing. We stayed a few days in Amsterdam and saw the museums and all that. Then we rented a car. We drove to Brussels to see my sister, who was still alive then, and her daughter, my niece Renee, and some other friends I had. Some of the people whom I had known before the war, and I was sort of their kids were a little older than I, but we were sort of fairly close. We were close in terms of, we called them aunt and uncle. They got out of Belgium. They were Belgians early on and went to London, and he was sort of a senior, not a member of the government, but a senior consultant in the government. And so I seen him during the war a number of times in London, and so they obviously were people I would go back and see. As a matter of fact, their daughter was in the British. It was a woman Air Force, in the British Air Force, and after the war, she was stationed in Paris. And when I went on leave there a couple times, and she could take me to these places that us French soldiers couldn't go to, and she would take me to some of these PX places, and they had patisserie, and my thing was chocolate eclair with whipped cream in the middle, not anything else, and that was always the highlight of my visit with her. So that's then eventually after a number of years, and of course the SRI people. After I left, we had a lunch bunch. People who got together once a week on for Tuesday lunch, and.
So you retired.
Retired
when?
In '92.
In '92, okay.
And the people, I was going to say three of the five at the time were Stanford people. Two of them had been there. All three of them had been there after I was. Nobody is as old as I am, but we had the same professor, same experience, and all that, and we've always remained friends.
And during that whole time, those almost 40 years at SRI, you never talked about your past in France and during the war?
No, I became a citizen in '59, I guess, and after you go through the exams and all that, then the final swearing in, you needed two witnesses, and Alan Peterson was one of my two witnesses, and I'd been married at the time and sort of thought, well, if you're an immigrant, you're named Jakubowski, and nobody could pronounce it, and all the office mail was always Walter J. Dot. I'll change my name.
Okay.
And so I went to court. You had to go to court and you change the name to Walter J. It was going to be Jaye. The E was because Jay is too Chinese. Now I don't mean to imply anything, but so it became Jaye, and that's the way my kids are.
Yes. And did you talk to your kids? When did you start to talk about the war with your son and daughter?
When I met a certain lecturer at Stanford University named Marie-Pierre. I'm not kidding you.
Okay.
There were, when my niece, even my sister and I never talked about it when she was alive.
You never talked about the contribution?
That was just, I'm not untypical in that respect. You just want to forget. Mm-hmm. You want to cut as many of the ties that expose you mm-hmm. in any form and shape. And the last thing you want to do is the only people who knew were the people in security, because when you fill out a security personal security questionnaire, the PSQ, they ask you if you ever used an alibi. Well, I had a half a page of explanation there.
Yes.
And have you ever been arrested? I had a page in there. And so, but only the technical details. Mm-hmm. You know, no, there was no background. You know.
Well, thank you very much for opening up about your, life trajectory. I think it's very precious for, not only your family and the people around you, but for the generations to come to know, what you did during the war and.
Well, thank you, Marie-Pierre. It's
trajectory.
It's been. There's a nice French word which I don't know what the English would be. Soulagement.
Soulagement.
If you know what a good English equivalent is.
Relief.
Relief, I guess, is a good one, which doesn't quite say the same mm-hmm. thing as that. To be able to just recall, there's a lot of things which it's if you have enough of it, it's called PTSD. But you don't have to have PTSD. There are a lot of things which will trigger nightmares, mm-hmm. And some of it has to do with things you see on TV today, mm-hmm. Particularly when you look at the Syrians trying to escape the rat trap they're in.
Yes.
That brings back memories, and not pleasant ones, but it's been 70 years, so mm-hmm. I've adjusted.
Well, merci beaucoup.
So, I was very hesitant to talk to you at first. Mm-hmm. Diana encouraged me, very much so. And of course, who can resist you?
Well, I'm so happy you did. Yes.
So
I'm very grateful for.
Well, I appreciate it, and it's been, and of course the reward that you engineered, to coin a word, it's sitting on the table in there, and there's a plaque, several plaques, and that has been quite an honor, and I've been very, very proud of it and grateful to you for having gotten that, because it's it's not common, and I appreciate that.
No, it's not. I mean, it's the most prestigious French award for the great service you did during the war.
Yeah, it was.
It was.
Yeah, I think it was. And I obviously feel that what I did turned out to be the right decision. I mean, when I first came as a student, my sister thought, "Oh, what are you doing that for? You're going to get a degree which nobody's going to recognize in France," which was technically actually not. It was correct. And she sort of tried to dissuade me. She said, "No, it's something, I want to find out where all these Americans I have met, where they're coming from, what's their background, where do they live?" And I'm glad I did.
And now, do you feel 100% American? Do you still feel a bit German or French attached? Or?
I would say I'm a pretty classical Euro-American. I have, after all, till the age 24, I was a European.
Okay.
And so many of my social and political leanings, and economic also, are European. But I have always, fundamentally all my working career was in the Defense Department for the U.S. government, and I felt it became sort of a second nature that this is my country. That's what any citizen ought to be doing. I was too old obviously for the Vietnam War, and so there was never any issue about that. But quite a large fraction of the career was during the Cold War. So it was easy. You had one enemy, and you know who he was, and it wasn't like it is today, where you don't know who your friend is and who your enemy is, just about. And it was a very, very rewarding career. I use the example. I never, on Monday mornings, never said, "Oh, I don't want to go to work." I always loved to go to work. I always enjoyed my work. I worked very hard. I traveled a lot on projects, but it was very, very satisfying. And I had a good career. I enjoyed it.